He came to her alone in the night with wide, gleaming eyes. It was 10 years since Nora last saw him. When she answered the door, her hair was nearly standing on end from the sight. "You still look like a child. The years were so kind to you, sister." She didn't want to say it out loud, but they weren't kind to him. It was almost 2 in the morning when she offered him a chair into the living room. She didn't say a word until they both sat down, not even a hello. This was no surprise. After all, it was exactly 10 years since they parted ways. And he was back, just like he said he would be. Finally she spoke, folding her hands in her lap. "Part of me didn't think you would come, Martin." She glared at him. "I hoped it was over. But here you are." "Here I am!" His purple and red jester hat hung down over his face. There were little bells on the tips that jingled every time he moved his head. The tips of the hat reminded her of tentacles, and she shuddered. Nora stood up and turned the knob of her TV set and fiddled with the antenna. Nothing decent was ever on at this hour. They'd been replaying the same thing for days. Eisenhower was giving a paranoid speech about communism, warning the nations that everyone was a suspect. Nora stared at the TV, wishing she could just be sucked into it. Maybe then she would finally be free from all of this. "It's been so long that I can hardly remember," she said. "Where are we supposed to go?" Inside, she already knew the answer. She just wanted to hear him repeat it to make sure that this was not a dream. Martin's face was covered in black and white makeup. There was little triangles under both eyes that looked like tears. She cringed, realizing that it looked more worn in than makeup should. It blended in perfectly to his skin. There was no color on his face except for the thin, red line traced around his lips. His mouth was painted into a permanent smile, and the creases were almost sinister. The rest of the outfit clashed horribly with the tendrils of the jester hat. His shirt was ruffled in green with little yellow triangles across the chest. All of his clothes were covered in dirt, and there were plenty of holes. He looked like he fell out of a circus clothes reject bin. He was really hard to look at. "We're going to see Melinda. How could you forget?" His sick smile gaped open in awe. "She's been waiting for us for a long time." "Melinda isn't waiting for you," she said. "You're the last person she wants to see." "I doubt you wanted to see me either." "But you were still expecting me," he said. Nora gulped. The jester's ear twitched from under the hat, picking up the sound. "Let's not make this any worse than it has to be," she said. The bells on his pointed shoes jingled as he climbed to his feet. He offered a hand to her, helping her stand. "I'm sure we'll have a wonderful time, sister." She grabbed his skeletal hand and stood up. She was all ready to go, but suddenly she remembered. It was improper to leave the house in a nightgown. "Let me get dressed." Her nightgown was long and white, with little bows down the front. "There is no time," he said. "Besides, no one will see us where we're going." If Martin wore a jester's outfit covered in dirt, then surely she could get away with wearing a nightgown. She sighed and headed for the door. "Fine, I guess." "Fine, I guess fashion is the least of our worries," she said. She put her hand on the doorknob, and the cold metal seemed to jolt her back to reality. For the first time, she was overcome by fear. Her hand shivered, and for a moment, she wanted nothing more than to run away and never look back. She looked back at Martin and knew that there was no escape. "Are you sure we have to do this?" There was no point in trying to reason with him, but she tried anyway. "You made the deal 10 years ago. You knew the consequences. But you said you would give anything," he said. Nora didn't bother responding. She tried not to look at him and threw open the door. Martin followed her out into the night, and they began their long walk. A yellow-tainted moon watched over them as they made their way silently through the streets. As they walked along the winding, cracked sidewalks, Nora wished that they would have run into someone. She never hoped for anything more in her life. Someone, anyone, must be out at this hour. But it was getting close to 3 a.m. and no one in the neighborhood stayed up past 10. They walked in silence for what seemed like an eternity, and then time began to blend together. Every once in a while, Martin would mutter something under his breath. Everything he said made the hair on the back of Nora's neck stand up. Nora stared up at the moon, cold and distant above their heads. She was reminded of the childhood and terrible events that took place so long ago. It all started on a night just like this, with a freezing moon. 10 years had passed since the nightmare began. A chill ran down her spine, and thoughts began to race. For a moment, she was overwhelmed by something that she hadn't felt in 10 years. Clarity. A voice in the back of her mind screamed at her to run. Freedom beckoned her far beyond the winding streets. We're getting closer. I can almost taste her. The jester's voice snapped her back to reality, like a needle pricking into her eye. Nora's hands shook violently as she looked at the jester. With every step, those awful little bells on his shoes jingled. She needed to get away. His peeling white skin and terrible grin were driving her to the edge of madness. Her eyes darted around as she looked for the best way to escape. Far off in the distance, beyond the winding streets, there was a forest. Maybe she would be safer there. The jester hummed to himself. It was an old, strange tune, like nothing Nora had ever heard before. It made her legs feel like they had turned to jelly. For a moment, he seemed transfixed by the moon. He smiled fondly up at the sky, still humming those eerie notes from ages past. It all happened suddenly, like an atomic bomb being dropped over an unsuspecting city. Nora's heart raced at 1,000 beats per second as she bolted off into the night. The forest called out her name, begging her to lay down and sleep in its soft grass. The wind tickled at her face and blew through her hair as she fled. Everything was perfect, just as it should be. She was born to run. Her mind was overcome by visions of the future, and she tasted the sweet blood of freedom at last. But no, it was her blood, and the world was spinning. Her whole body felt like it was being ripped apart, cell by cell. With a violent heave, she puked blood onto the sidewalk. She tasted bile and defeat. Her pale frame collapsed onto the pavement, and the moon shone down on her mockingly. She couldn't stop coughing, and with every breath, she drew more and more blood into her lungs. The jester loomed over her, blocking out the moon. Poor Nora. Sweet, misguided Nora. Where did you think you were going? The forest seemed as distant as the cold rings of Saturn. Nora no longer felt like a human being. She was some sort of vicarious liquid contained by skin. A hemorrhaging bag of blood and bile. Her anatomy began to fade as quickly as it came. You know better than that. Your flesh belongs to me. You're nothing but a placeholder. He shook his head in disgust, showing anger for the first time ever in Nora's memory. Did you really think you could escape? To emphasize his point, he held out his hand. His fingers gnarled viciously into the air, as squeezing an imaginary sphere. Nora's head instantly felt like it was going to explode, and she threw up again. Your flesh belongs to me. The jester's cruel laugh was all she could hear. No matter where you go, no matter who you hide behind. Her eardrums felt as if they were going to rupture. His voice was louder than the darkest scream. "Do you understand?" "Yes, yes!" She sobbed and screamed into the night, bleeding all over the sidewalk. The skin of her hands had begun to rupture. Inside, her organs felt as if they were going to burst with every movement. "I understand!" And suddenly it stopped. Her heart slowed down at last, and it no longer felt like it was going to explode. "Good!" The happiness in his voice was genuine as he extended a hand to help her up. Always polite, he even helped brush the dirt off the front of her gown. An hour must have passed, along with hundreds of houses that all looked the same. Finally, they reached a fork in the road, and they followed a broken sign that read Allen Street. Nora knew the house the moment she saw it, and Martin did too. And Martin did too, judging by the way he trotted excitedly to the door. It was a little red house with green shutters. Christmas colors, she thought. She stood on the steps, keeping her distance. Her brother was bolder than her, and wasted no time heading for the door. Nora dug around in her pockets as the jester knocked. The door flew open almost instantly, and there was an unwelcome hiss, and the air was filled with a stinging cloud. Nora coughed and almost tripped down the steps, fleeing. She shielded her eyes and heard a girl scream, "Stay back! Stay the hell away from my house, you monster!" Nora's throat burned a little from the mace, but luckily she stayed out of the blast radius. Martin wasn't so lucky. It seemed the girl who had answered the door didn't want any visitors. She sprayed him mercilessly in the face. She threw the can on the porch and reached into the pocket of her bathrobe. Nora gasped when she saw her pull out a pistol. It was just like her sister to be resourceful and prepared. Martin coughed relentlessly for a moment, but then appeared to be unscathed. The attack didn't seem to have much an effect on him. "Melinda, is that any way to treat a guest? Clearly you were expecting us." His voice was raspy, probably from being sprayed in the face with mace. The girl stood in her doorway, waving the pistol around like a maniac. "Nora, is that you? You've got to be kidding me. You brought him to my house?" Tears were running down Melinda's face now. Her long blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a pink bathrobe and red cat-eye glasses. Nora said nothing. There was no point. Martin would do all the talking regardlessly. "We made this deal a long time ago, Melinda. There's no use fighting." "Now shut your pretty little mouth," he said. "You'll wake the neighbors." "Melinda, I think you should just let us in. He's right. We can't hide any longer." Nora's voice trailed off. Her sister stared at her with such contempt that she couldn't bear to say anything else. Melinda still aimed her pistol at the jester's hat. Finally, she backed down, stepping aside so that they could come in. Martin trotted through the door, his shoes jangling. Nora wasn't so eager. She stood outside in silence for a moment, looking up at the moon. She finally followed him into the house, shutting the door behind him. This was an awful house, Nora thought. She always hated it here. Peeling yellow wallpaper smothered them from all sides. All the furniture was from over a decade ago. The drab, plain designs of the 1940s were disturbing to Nora. A musty smell lingered in the air, the same one that haunted her for an entire childhood. Her eyes were fixated on the portraits on the walls. There was her grandfather, frowning in black and white. Her parents' wedding photo hung next to it. But the one that made her squirm was of the 3 children. There were 2 girls with a little boy in the middle. Both the girls were smiling, but the boy scowled. "What do you want from me? Haven't you taken enough?" Melinda's screams were frantic now. She was still crying as she pointed the gun at the jester. "Why can't you go back to hell where you belong?" "Because you made a deal, sister. You wanted this, remember? He laughed mockingly, not bothered by the gun at all. I didn't make a deal. I was a goddamn kid. I had no clue what I was doing. Melinda breathed heavily. There were beads of sweat on her forehead as she yelled, "You're the devil! You're nothing but a devil!" Nora stared back at the portrait of the three kids. None of them looked like they had a care in the world. It was hard to believe that one of the happy little girls was her. Back when she could still smile. Back before the nightmare. If only those portrait kids knew what the future had in store. Her voice was desperate now. "What do you want from me?" she whimpered quietly. "It's your turn to go into the basement," he said. "Don't worry, it's not so bad. I was there long before you were born." Melinda's eyes were wide and glassy. No, why me? Why do I have to go next? Why not her?" She trembled uncontrollably and looked to her sister for an answer. Nora said nothing. "That was the order we agreed on, remember? First your brother goes in the basement, then it's your turn. And then sweet, quiet Nora goes last." His bony hands moved wildly, tracing in circles in the air over and over. "It's a beautiful cycle, isn't it? All of you take turns." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. Nora could hear her heart pounding in her ears as she just stared at the jester. He'd really done a job on her brother's body. She was starting to think that awful white makeup really was permanent. It almost looked like his skin was withered and cracked. She wondered if he burned it on, and that creepy blood-red outline around his lips. It almost looked like real blood. "No, I can't do this. I don't want to. I don't want to go. I can't," Melinda screamed relentlessly. "Take her and said I'd rather die than rot in that basement for a decade." The jester grabbed her by the hand, leading her towards the cellar door. He was almost polite about it. He gripped her hand gently and carefully. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, darling. It's your turn. We all have to go through it." Melinda's face was almost as pale as Martin's now. Her pistol clattered to the floor, and she surrendered to his will. He opened up the basement door and led her down the stairs. Nora trailed slowly behind them, standing at the top of the staircase, and watched them descend. She followed regretfully, flicking on the light switch at the top of the stairs. Nora heard her sister weeping somewhere up ahead. It looked like no one had been down in that basement for years. There was an old mannequin at the bottom of the stairs. Old clothes and dusty bags hung from the rafters. She walked past the stacks of old boxes and recognized some of her childhood toys. There was her old rocking horse tucked away into a distant corner. It tilted back and forth, creaking ominously. They walked until they reached the end of the basement. Long before they saw it, she could see it in her mind's eye. She knew what awaited them in the dark, musty corner. An old wooden toy chest was the only thing left in that part of the basement. Melinda let out a blood-curdling scream when she saw it, falling to her knees. "Are you ready, Melinda?" The jester wasted no time. He threw back the lid of the oak chest and grinned like a psychopath. His smile was horribly accentuated by the blood around his lips. Nora was instantly drawn to the chest. A purple light emanated from it. She peered inside. 10 years had passed since Nora had seen her brother. And there he was inside. Inside the chest, there was a lifelike jester doll. It wore a purple and green hat, and had little tiny bells on its pointy shoes. Its skin was ghastly pale, and the black paint under its eyes made it look like it was crying. The doll's face was permanently fixed into a frown. The most striking thing about it was its terrified blue eyes. They almost seemed to move as Nora gazed into them. She recognized those eyes. It was Martin, her beloved brother. In the naivety of childhood, she had condemned him to the worst of fates. The real Jester's hands were glowing with the same eerie purple light that came from inside the chest. His smile stretched so wide that it threatened to tear his face in half. Maybe that's why it was so red around the edges, Nora thought, because he contorted his smile so gruesomely that it made him bleed. After all, it was so good to be alive. Melinda kneeled on the floor, bowing her head. She didn't even bother to look in the chest. It was too much for her. After all, it would be her tomb for the next 10 years. It's your turn, Melinda. You'll be sucked into the chest for a while, but there's good news. Your brother gets his body back, he said. And I get yours. How exciting! I've never been a girl before. Usually, only little boys are stupid enough to make the deal with me, he giggled. You'll get your body back eventually, of course, in 10 years. But I hope you don't mind if I make some modifications, he said. What kind of modifications? Melinda whimpered as tears ran down her face. Oh, you know, the usual. Your face is pretty, but it's so plain. The jester stroked Melinda's cheek lovingly, admiring her soft skin. I never feel at home in a body until I'm wearing a mask. Nora gazed at the monster. She couldn't believe that body once belonged to her brother. It didn't look a thing like him anymore. The jester had desecrated it, making him into a fool. His entire face was covered in white scar tissue, singed to the bone. His lips always looked as if they were covered in fresh blood. His was a mask that could never be removed. I took an iron to my face last time. His voice was casual with a hint of excitement. To give it some color, putting on all the makeup every day is such a pain. So one day, while I was looking at myself in the mirror, I got a brilliant idea. He shrugged as Melinda sobbed on the floor. Might as well just burn it on. Nora stroked her sister's hair absent-mindedly, but felt nothing. In 10 years, they would be back again, and this would be her. For a split second, she dreamed of the freezing moon above her head and felt herself drifting through the stars, free forever. But she remembered the taste of blood and came to her senses. She was back on the sidewalk, puking up bile and tasting fear. Her flesh belonged to the jester, and it was far beyond her control. Her memories drifted back to her childhood. The three triplets had spent countless hours playing in the basement, and their favorite toy was the sad jester doll. They often fought over who got to play with it. They acted out elaborate scenes and even built a whole circus once. They built tents from sheets and used toy dinosaurs in place of elephants. They loved that doll more than they loved each other. How they wished it could be real. They devoted so much time and love to the jester doll that no one was surprised when one day it turned into a sentiment. Nora remembered it like it was yesterday. Their dream had come true. The jester had talked, and he had a deal for them. The doll could finally be real, but the catch was, it had to trade bodies with someone who was already alive. But that was a small price to pay, right? After all, they were only 8 years old. The girls had ganged up on Martin and decided that he would go first. Don't worry, Martin. You'll get to play with the real jester in 10 years when it's your turn. Children don't have much foresight, Nora thought. In the beginning, life went on. The triplets got good grades in school and went to church every Sunday. But it wasn't long before people started to notice a change in little Martin. I see the devil in his eyes. Even all these years later, their mother's voice haunted Nora. The next year was difficult for the family. Neighbors began to complain about dead pets drained of blood. Miss McCoy, the old woman next door, snitched on Martin for his late-night walks. She claimed that she often caught him staring into her window in the dead of night. It wasn't long before she turned up dead. Drained of blood, of course. Martin became less secretive about his love for homemade taxidermy. His room was filled with dead animal husks. He collected flesh of all kinds, from roadkill to family pets. a horrible smell stuck to his skin at all times. Their mother gave up on telling him to wash his hands, and there was always blood caked under his fingernails. Their parents didn't dare to ask questions. Nora and Melinda pretended to know nothing and barely spoke with Martin anymore. Once Melinda threatened to tell their mother about the little change, but as she ran off to find her, she collapsed on the floor and began to vomit blood. It seemed that whenever they tried to tell their secret, something stopped them. Nora knew better than try to resist. Her sister was a fool, she told herself. As the days passed, Martin grew more and more distant. None of the other children would play with him anymore. The Raymond family moved to a new town after living next door for 20 years. Martin hardly ever slept and began to disappear from the house for weeks at a time. Their parents didn't dare question him. They shivered whenever he talked about sending them down to the basement, and that was enough to keep them in line. By age 14, Martin looked like he was about 30. He was balding and appeared to be stricken by severe jaundice. He never ate, at least in front of the family. No one ever asked what he did during those long hours spent in the basement. That year, their father disappeared. Their mother never asked where he went, but Nora knew. Late at night, she heard his screams echoing through the furnace vents. The police had little interest in their father's disappearance. Everyone knew what went on in that house, and they knew that it was useless to question the family. The mother was an emotionless zombie, and the girls began to hemorrhage at the mouth whenever anything regarding their brother was mentioned. On their 15th birthday, Martin disappeared, but Nora knew better than to celebrate. No one ever talked about him or asked where he went. From the sudden reports of a serial murder in northern Minnesota, she suspected that he was there. But no matter how many miles were between them, Nora still felt his eyes on the back of her neck at all times. Your flesh belongs to me, Nora. I'm saving you for last. Every night she heard those words in her dreams. Melinda's squeals snapped her back to reality. No, please, just kill me. I don't want to go in the chest. I don't deserve any of this. We were only kids. We didn't know what we were doing. Please, please, please. Melinda begged, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. She stared helplessly at Nora with her piercing green eyes. Well, let's get on with it. The jester was cheery as he laid a hand on Melinda's shoulders. He reached for the doll and held it in his hands. Both hands were glowing intensely now, emulating that wicked purple light. He chanted under his breath, and the air began to churn. The room spun like a vortex, and Melinda shrieked so loudly that Nora's ears felt like they would bleed. But soon, her scream died off. The jester's body collapsed to the floor in a heap. Melinda's head raised up slowly, and the fear was gone from her eyes. Her lips slowly curled into a smile. Her eyes had changed. They weren't green anymore, but a cold shade of gray. The same eyes the jester had a moment earlier. The jester's body was curled up lifelessly on the floor. The doll, a miniature version of the man who held it, lay close by. Nora picked up the doll with shaking hands. Its green eyes were spinning wildly with horror. They were Melinda's eyes. A tear ran down from the doll's face before Nora placed it into the chest where it belonged.